It's Friday, March 30th. I'm Jennifer Siegel, and you're listening to Uptown Radio.
And I'm Sarah Wyman. Queens residents are learning how to use open record laws to fight new developments that they say will drive up local rents.
This is a very nerdy and wonky thing to do, but there are opportunities here for us to expose corruption such that we believe we can kill this project.
New York City guarantees translators to help foreign language speakers communicate with public agencies. But some say the city isn't always providing this service.
This is part of the assembly person job. You don't do it, you fail it.
Low-income New Yorkers could lose access to affordable internet service because of changes proposed by the chairman of the FCC.
He wants more and more money to go to the rural areas. He doesn't really give a whit about poor people in urban areas.
All this and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The family of Stephon Clark is disclosing the results of an independent autopsy that they say contradicts the account of the Sacramento, California police officers who shot and killed him March 18th. The pathologist concluded Clark took up to 10 minutes to die. Clark, a 22-year-old African-American man, was in his grandparents' backyard when police confronted him. The officers had said they were investigating criminal activity in the area and thought Clark had a gun. He was found with a cell phone. John Sepulvedo of member station KQED reports on the autopsy and remarks from the attorney for the Clark family.
Members of the community who attended the press conference could be heard gasping in horror as the legal team presented its findings that show Stephon Clark was shot by Sacramento police officers 6 times from the back, meaning he was turned away from the officers. Attorneys for Stephon Clark say they will file suit in federal court, but are unsure exactly when those suits will come. Ben Crump, a lawyer for the family, says he plans to file in federal court after other investigative leads are followed. For NPR News, I'm John Sepulvedo in Sacramento.
The pathologist the Clark family hired is Dr. Bennett Omalu, whose study on the long-term impact of concussions pro football players sustain prompted the NFL to adopt new safety rules. The widow of the Orlando Pulse nightclub gunman is cleared of all charges against her. Amy Green of member station WMFE reports on the jury's decision this morning to find Noor Salman not guilty.
Noor Salman was charged with providing material support to a terrorist organization and obstruction of justice. She was accused of knowing about her husband's plans for the 2016 massacre that left 49 dead. Salman and family members wept in the courtroom as the verdict was read. She said thank you to her attorneys. Pulse survivors and family members also were emotional. Salman was taken into custody 7 months after the mass shooting. She told FBI agents in the hours after the attack that she had known what her husband was planning. Her attorneys argued at trial that her statements were coerced and are false. For NPR News, I'm Amy Green in Orlando.
An American soldier and a British soldier have been killed in a roadside bombing in northern Syria. Here's NPR's Greg Myrie.
The 2 soldiers were part of a coalition convoy that was hit Thursday night in Manbij, a town near the border with neighboring Turkey. Military officials say 5 troops were also injured, including 1 American. The coalition drove Islamic State extremists out of Manbij last year, and that part of Syria has been relatively calm since then. This marks the 3rd American death in Syria since U.S. forces entered the fighting there more than 3 years ago. The U.S. military says it expects to remain in Syria, but President Trump said Thursday the U.S. would likely be leaving very soon. Greg Myrie, NPR News, Washington.
This is NPR News.
For Columbia Radio
listening
News,
to WNYC.
I'm Elisa Escarce. Negotiations over the New York State budget have stalled over the issue of schools, specifically religious schools. State Senator Simcha Felder of Brooklyn is demanding that private Jewish colleges known as yeshivas be exempted from state standards. Felder's district is home to a large Orthodox Jewish community. The plan is the final sticking point. The debate is the final sticking point in negotiations over a $168 billion spending plan, which includes new funding for public housing and transit in the city. The deadline to pass something is tomorrow. The debate could lead to a shutdown. A Suffolk County judge was on the other side of the courthouse today. Robert Cicali pleaded guilty to burglary. He was arrested yesterday morning after sneaking into his 23-year-old neighbor's home and stealing dirty underwear out of her hamper. At a press conference, Suffolk County District Attorney Tim Sini said Cicali is not above the law.
Obviously, this case is highly disturbing. This is an individual who swore to uphold the law and violated it in a very serious way.
In Pennsylvania, the judge overseeing Bill Cosby's trial hinted today that he might keep jurors from hearing some incriminating testimony. Cosby is facing charges that he drugged and molested former Temple University administrator Andrea Constand in 2004. Cosby previously admitted that he gave Quaaludes to a 19-year-old and had sex with her in the 1970s. Prosecutors in the current case plan to use that testimony to portray him as a serial predator. But Cosby's lawyers say the evidence is not relevant to the current case. Judge Stephen O'Neill says he won't rule on the testimony until Cosby's retrial, which is scheduled to start in April. And big groups of basking sharks are hanging out off the Atlantic coast from Nova Scotia to Long Island. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says groups between 30 and 1,400 have been spotted, which is more than usual. The basking shark is the second largest fish on the planet, up to 25 feet long. But they are not aggressive or dangerous to humans. Experts say they don't know why there are so many sharks right now, but they think they might be socializing or even courting. I'm Elisa Escarce, Columbia Radio News.
The latest target in a series of shakeups under the Trump administration is the Department of Veteran Affairs, or the VA. Earlier this week, President Trump announced David Shulkin, the Secretary of Veteran Affairs, will be replaced by Dr. Ronnie L. Jackson, the president's personal physician. Shulkin was an outspoken critic of President Trump's plans to privatize the VA.
Suzanne Gordon teaches nursing at the University of California, San Francisco. She says privatized healthcare just won't be able to meet the demand and specific needs of veterans.
On almost every measure, the VA is equal or superior to the private sector in delivering healthcare to complex older, sicker, and poorer veterans. I mean, the private sector delivers fragmented, episodic, expensive care. In the American healthcare system is the least efficient in the industrialized world, the most costly, and it doesn't have the capacity to deal with these veterans. I mean, the VA practically invented geriatric care, and veterans would simply be unable to access this in the private sector. There's no integration of primary and mental health care, which is so important for veterans because they have more mental health problems. And as for suicide, we have a very big problem with veteran suicide, and they have a very robust suicide prevention program in the VA, including helping to try to get veterans to separate temporarily from their firearms when they are feeling depressed and suicidal. And that just doesn't exist in the private sector.
It sounds like there's really a lot at stake here. What are the key challenges that the agency is facing today?
The VA has some problems that could be actually fairly easily fixed. Those places where it has trouble are usually often rural hospitals where it's very hard to recruit physicians and nurses and staff. There are significant problems in the VA, and many of them have to do with lack of staffing. We have over 35,000 positions that are vacant that they're not filling.
Just looking forward, the VA is a gigantic agency. Is moving to privatization even doable? If it is, what do you think the first steps would be? What should we be on the lookout for?
Well, they're already doing it. It's happening right now. Congress passed a temporary measure to outsource more care that isn't working called the Choice Program, and they've made it permanent. There are bills in Congress that would allow veterans to go without referral to walk-in clinics, to mental health programs, to any provider they wanted to, at a huge cost to the taxpayer and to the veteran because they would get worse care. So this is not just some threat in the future, Sarah. This is like happening right now.
Suzanne Gordon is the author of The Battle for Veterans Healthcare. Thank you so much for joining us, Suzanne.
Thank you for having me.
Here in New York, a recent report from the U.S. Census Bureau has confirmed what a lot of us already know. Affordable housing is harder and harder to find. Only about 1% of the lowest rent housing is vacant right now.
But residents of rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods want more control over what happens in their communities, and they're learning how public records can help. Uptown Radio's Elisa Escarce reports.
I'm going to ask you two questions.
Luis Flores is standing at the front of a small crowd in the Greater Astoria Historical Society in Queens. About 15 people sit in rows of chairs. Most are activists in a group called the Queens Anti-Gentrification Project. Flores is an investigative journalist, and he's here tonight to give these activists a tool for a fight in their neighborhood. Public documents from the city using New York's Freedom of Information law.
This is a very nerdy and wonky thing to do, but there are opportunities here for us to expose corruption such that we believe we can kill this project.
The project he wants to kill is the Brooklyn-Queens Connector, or BQX. It's a streetcar that the city has proposed to connect Astoria to other neighborhoods along the waterfront of Queens and Brooklyn. Several of those neighborhoods are gentrifying quickly. Flores worries that projects like the streetcar could raise rents even higher.
I've been in New York for about 20 years, and I've been in Queens for like 19 of those 20 years. And the city is changing. I can no longer afford to live in New York. Why would we file open records requests not about the beach?
The crowd brainstorms ideas of other projects they could request records about. A woman sitting at the edge of the room suggests looking into luxury housing being planned in the neighborhood. Gentrification is old news in New York City. But a new survey from the U.S. Census Bureau shows that it's harder than ever for low-income people to find a place to rent, even though the total amount of housing is at a historic high. The survey measures vacancy rates in rental apartments. Only about 1% of the lowest rent apartments are vacant and available these days, compared with almost 9% in the most expensive buildings. Affordable housing has been one of Mayor de Blasio's priorities, and some housing advocates say the city's efforts over the last few years have been unprecedented. Here's Jolie Milstein, CEO of the New York State Association for Affordable Housing.
I think that they are, if not winning here, they're certainly achieving remarkable results with the commitment of prioritizing a lot of capital, public and private capital, to address the housing crisis.
Last year, the city built or preserved more than 24,000 affordable units. That's a record high. Emily Goldstein is a senior campaign organizer with the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. She says that despite the city's efforts,
the amount of housing available at the lower ends of the spectrum is shrinking. Meanwhile, there has been a construction boom, but much of what's being constructed is expensive at the higher end of the market.
And those higher end buildings can have an impact on the rents around them.
When lots of new market rate housing is created, it can drive speculation, it can drive up the sort of top amount that a local landlord can get in a given neighborhood.
Back in Astoria, the public records training wraps up. Christina Chase heads out of the Historical Society and onto Broadway. She's the person who wanted to look into luxury housing.
I went to school like 2 blocks that way on 37th. Like, this is where I grew up, literally.
Chase grew up in public housing. She's 28, and she says the neighborhood has changed a lot since she was a kid, like on this block.
Okay, Broadway Silk store and the meat store has always been there. Everything, and the chicken spot, but everything, and the deli. Everything else is new, though.
She wants to use public records to find out what might change in the future.
Because a lot of the time, our perspectives and needs are left out of the conversation, and that's really unfair.
Chase is about to start grad school, and she wants to be a youth worker. She says she hopes to get young people involved in requesting documents about their communities and do research together. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Elisa Escarce.
New York City has one of the most comprehensive laws in the country when it comes to providing translators for residents not fluent in English. It's called Local Law 30.
But some New Yorkers, especially those from African countries, complain that finding translators that speak their unique dialect are sometimes hard to come by. Dan Rabb reports.
It may be a gray March evening outside the Dempsey Community Center on 127th Street in Harlem, but inside the bleak cinder block walls, one room brims with energy and the smell of spicy jollof rice, a West African favorite.
So we'd like you to give us your name, what country you're from, and how do you say hello or greet one in your language.
Okay, my name is Agnes. I was born in Cameroon.
Tonight is the monthly meeting of African Communities Together, an immigration advocacy group. Members organized tonight's meeting to address what many say is their greatest challenge, a lack of adequate translation services by city agencies.
If you speak Wolof and you go to Harlem Hospital, and you say, I need somebody to interpret for me in Wolof, they are supposed to find you a person.
Amaha Casa is the group's founder. He was one of the major proponents of Local Law 30.
If you go and you say, I speak Madigo, I need an interpreter for my parent-teacher conference, they are supposed to find you someone.
But Casa says just because government agencies are supposed to provide a translator, it doesn't mean that they always do.
I asked for one, they gave me Igbo, and Igbo is not my language.
Ngozi Oleme is from Nigeria. Her kids attend PS 42 in the Bronx, and at a recent parent-teacher conference, the school brought in a Nigerian translator. Oleme speaks Okwane, but the translator spoke Igbo. The school considers Okwame and Igbo dialects, but Oleme says they're different languages, and she couldn't understand her translator. She got so frustrated that she walked out of the meeting.
When I'm saying something, the person is saying something different. He's not understanding me. I'm not getting it right. Since then, I never asked for translation no more, because anytime you ask, it's not what you ask for.
More than 73,000 New Yorkers speak African languages at home, and nearly 70% of these residents have a limited proficiency in English. Chauncey Young works with immigrant parents in the Bronx.
You see less West African families participating in school-based events because there's not language provided.
He says many New York City schools assume African parents all speak colonial languages like French. But, he says, typically only men, and only men from wealthier families, are fluent in French or English.
The mothers of the African community are less proficient English speakers, and yet, mothers are more engaged with the schools than fathers.
Young says it's the moms who tend to make healthcare decisions in African households, so a lack of qualified translators can mean problems at the clinic or doctor's office for families too. The city only employs full-time translators for the most common African languages, like Wolof and Fulani. Activists like Malian-born Nabi Niambele say the city is not meeting the requirements of the law.
This is part of the borough job. This is part of the district job. This is part of the assembly person job. You don't do it, you fail it. And they have been failing this for a long time.
Chauncey Young and activists like Amaha Casa give the city more credit. They say the quality of language services varies between different schools and city offices, and that's to be expected less than a year after the law's rollout. But they're also looking for ways to fill in the gaps. African Communities Together is building a language services co-op, which it says will employ 11 full-time translators. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Dan Rabb.
The language barrier is just one problem for the thousands of Central American children who streamed across the border during a 2014 migration crisis.
One young migrant used a unique program to stay in the U.S. legally. But some fear President Trump may be closing the door on this particular plan to citizenship.
On the busy corner of 47th and Van Dam in Long Island City, I walk into the Van Dam Diner. Daniel Kaplan, an older man in a gray fleece jacket, sits across the table from a young Latino. He's a bit scrawny, in a white button-up shirt. He's energetically gesturing at Kaplan. The young man's name is Axel Diaz. They chatted about Axel's college courses and teased each other. Axel joked about Dan's salad.
I don't know how can you eat the type of salad, man. That doesn't even look like a salad.
What does it look like?
They bickered like old friends. Actually, 3 years ago, they became legal father and son. Axel had needed an American guardian so that he could apply for a green card under special immigrant juvenile status. But that's getting ahead of our story. For that, we need to go back to a small Central American country called El Salvador. The day before, at his kitchen table in Queens, Axel told me that things were easier when he was young.
I didn't have any worries. Besides having homework, everything was cool. Pretty cool.
Like many Salvadoran kids, he played soccer and climbed mango trees on the weekend. But Axel says that as he got older, things got scary.
You can't really be on the street after 9 p.m. The situation in my neighborhood was getting really dangerous.
Axel's neighborhood was crawling with gangs, and he became their target. When an ex-girlfriend started dating a gangster, he got jumped on the street.
Thank God they didn't kill me, because usually there, once these kinds of people get you, your time is up.
Somehow, he managed to escape. Family and friends watched the door all night. The very next day, his father went to buy food, and a man appeared, whispering in his ear.
He said if they saw me again, they were going to kill me. 3 days later, I left El Salvador.
Nearly 70,000 children made that trip to the border in 2014. Once here, one of the few ways an unaccompanied minor could stay in the United States is called special immigrant juvenile status. Lenny Benson is the director of the Safe Passage Project, which legally represents these kids.
Special immigrant juvenile status is a Congress-created form of relief for children who can establish that they've been abused, neglected, or abandoned by one or both parents.
Axel had run from the gangs, but he later told officials his father had been abusive and his mother was out of the picture, so he qualified. But he had to find a guardian in the United States, and that wasn't going to be easy.
I didn't trust anybody else in school, especially because I'm the kind of person who doesn't really trust anybody.
Except for one teacher, a music teacher, Daniel Kaplan. One day, there was a knock on Kaplan's door.
He came into my office and he said he wanted to talk to me, and I said, sure. And I think he was a little bit hesitant, but he was pretty direct.
Back at the diner, Kaplan was excited when recounting his answer. He waved his hands, swatting the microphone.
Yes. Yeah. I'm getting all teary just thinking about it.
Diaz and Kaplan finish their lunch, hug, and say goodbye. Kaplan is leaving for a vacation in Paris.
Paris? France? Want to come?
Nah, I don't got papers, my friend. I'll get it put to you.
We can't leave the country yet.
I can leave the country. Everybody. I'll see you, all right? Take care.
Now, Axel is just waiting for his green card to arrive in the mail. Residency means he will be able to take out loans to study immigration law. But it's not smooth sailing for others. President Trump has repeatedly said that paths to residency for people like Axel allow gang members into the United States. And New York lawyers reported that this week, children like Axel are being denied SIJ status if they are over 18. Axel says President Trump is wrong to close the door on kids fleeing violence.
I feel like the only way to prove him wrong is finding something in this country. Being someone in this country. It's the only way to show someone they're wrong. I could have decided to be a gangster in my country, but that didn't happen. I came here, I went to high school, I had my son, went to university.
Violence continues to rise in Central America, and kids continue to cross the border. El Salvador now has the highest homicide rate in the world. Safe back in Queens, Axel's family dreamed aloud for their son, Christopher, who was born in the United States.
Our hope is that he goes to Harvard.
Reporting from New York City, this is Eileen Grunch, Columbia Radio News.
Earlier this week, the U.S. Commerce Department announced that the 2020 census will include a new question. Are you a U.S. citizen?
It's been almost 70 years since the census included a question about citizenship. And in cities like New York, with large immigrant populations, some fear that this new question might deter people from completing the census. So why has the question been added? I spoke with Andrew Beveridge, the president and CEO of Social Explorer, a data demography and mapping site. And what will it mean for this city if immigrants are scared away from answering the census? Why is it important that they be counted?
The census is only about two things, power and money. And so it could undercut the power of immigrants and thereby the power of New York City. So that means that legislation that affects this New York State and New York City, and a lot of New York City things are actually decided by the New York State legislature, those sorts of issues would be less New York City friendly. And then the second thing is just in terms of allocating money, it could easily undercut allocation of funds. You know, when the census was originally set up, there was a long debate about whether they should count everyone or count just citizens. And then when the 14th Amendment passed, there was once again a big discussion about whether they should count immigrants, children, women. They came down on the side of counting the whole population. So in a way, this undercuts that because this would give them the possibility of disregarding the non-citizen population.
What do you think the government is hoping to accomplish by including this question in the census?
It's hard to tell exactly. I mean, it obviously is further evidence of the hostility of the Trump administration to the immigrants in the United States. The 1940 census was used to round up Japanese for internment, and so they may also be concerned, immigrants, aside from the whole issue of, where are you? They might be concerned that this may be used for where ICE should go for raids.
And because of this, New York and 11 other states are suing over the addition of this question. What are the odds that this question will actually end up on the census?
I think it's a close question because first off, it never has gone to court before. In the 2010 census, Senator Vitter from Louisiana tried to put the citizenship question on. And it was debated and ultimately wasn't done. But right now we have a Republican Congress, so I think that it is going to be up to the courts.
So my final question is, why now? Why, after 70 years of being left off the census, is this question being asked again?
Republican redistrictors, they've gone as far as they could go with partisan gerrymandering. So I think in the long run, this is a way to stop the demographic trends that have been going on in the United States from actually affecting allocation of power and money.
Andrew Beveridge, CEO of Social Explorer. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
When tragedy strikes, we want answers. But those answers are not always easy to find. Reporter Colin Marston shares a personal story of moving from grief to acceptance in the face of a loved one's death.
I was stirring sugar into a cappuccino at a cafe in Mexico City when my phone began ringing. It was a sunny winter afternoon, and I was with my friend Raul. We were talking about small things, the things that ricochet around daily life. His teaching, books, finding a new apartment. Raul was midway through a joke when I picked up. It was Gene, my ex-boyfriend's current partner. I heard him crying, heaving. His voice was beyond despair. He told me Nico, my ex, had died. The night before, Nico had climbed to the top of their apartment building and thrown himself off the roof. At that moment, everything became quiet. I gripped the table and I said, I don't understand. In the taxi leaving, I couldn't sit up. I was sprawled across the frayed seat cushions. Raul had to give the address to the driver. I could barely speak. My whole body was in upheaval, in denial of an overwhelming sadness. Death inevitably provokes these feelings. Any tragedy is hard to make sense of. But even something as horrible as stage 4 cancer can provide an answer to cling to. There was a reason for the death. It was old age. It was the unavoidable assault of disease. It was chance mingled with fate. But suicide adds another dimension of confusion and pain to death. Family and friends wonder if it could have been avoided. Some feel guilty they weren't able to prevent it. Nico had been at a music festival in Guatemala when he took LSD. He was paranoid and absolutely certain forces beyond his control would any moment attack him, cause pain, harm. What was going through his mind when he climbed out of his window, up the fire escape, and into the California sky? I don't want this gruesome end to be the summation of Nico's life, but how someone dies becomes part of their story. It influences how we heal and remember. Arriving in Los Angeles for his funeral in Shiva, there was an air of secrecy. There had been an accident, the rabbi said. But that felt vague and not entirely true. Was it an accident? In this case, mental health, intention, and suicide all tangled into a knotty ball. Did the LSD mean it was the real Nico that killed himself? Did the drug trigger something he was already struggling with? Are we the same person under duress? In the attempt to preserve his legacy, how Nico died was gently submerged, pushed under, suppressed. Only a few people were privy to the truth. I can understand how the pain was too much to look squarely in the eye, but his death bewildered me. I became obsessed with finding an answer. Since then, a year has passed. Jean came to New York, and we were walking around Greenwich Village, still puzzling over past warning signs. Was it because Nico got fired from his job? Was it the pain of coming out? At some point, though, we started talking about how goofy he got when he became really tired, or how much he loved Van Morrison and was a romantic stuck in a different era. And I realized then that it's not about why it happened. What really matters is what happens now, and figuring out how he's still here.
To be born again, to be born again, let you go.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Jennifer Siegel.
And I'm Sarah Wyman. Don't go anywhere. There's more to come after this break.
Welcome back to Uptown Radio. I'm Jennifer Siegel.
And I'm Sarah Wyman.
Coming up this half hour, we look at how students are fighting segregation in the New York City school system.
And a story about the newest technology in driverless cars and why some are hesitant to embrace it.
These stories and more, but first, the news.
For Columbia Radio News, I'm Cassiana McClenahan. Stephon Clark's family has released an independent autopsy of his body. The 22-year-old was killed by police officers in Sacramento earlier this month. The officers were responding to reports of someone breaking car windows on the street when they shot Clark in his grandmother's backyard. Dr. Bennett Amalu examined Clark's body.
There were a total of 8 gunshot wounds.
Amalu went on to say that his findings showed that Clark was facing away from officers when he was shot. This is inconsistent with the officer's assertion that he was moving towards them. The widow of the Pulse nightclub shooter, Noor Salman, was acquitted today in Orlando, Florida. Salman had been charged with obstruction and providing material support to a terrorist organization after her husband left 49 people dead and 53 injured in the 2016 shooting. The case hinged on Salman's alleged confession, which came after 11 hours of questioning. The defense argued the confession had been coerced. 2 coalition troops have died and 5 people were injured after a roadside bomb exploded in northern Syria late Thursday night. One of the soldiers was American and the other was British, according to a U.S. defense official. The nationalities of those who were wounded have not been released. It's unclear how this attack may influence President Trump's Syria policy and the U.S. campaign against the Islamic State. Yesterday, during a rally in Ohio, the president surprised many when he said that U.S. troops in Syria would be coming home very soon. Terminator fans are breathing easier after hearing that Arnold Schwarzenegger is in stable condition after an emergency procedure to replace a failing valve in his heart. The 70-year-old actor is scheduled to star in new installments of Conan the Barbarian and the Terminator series. He will indeed be back. It's 60 degrees and sunny in Central Park. It's looking like a dry and mild spring weekend with highs in the mid-50s. The 7 train is running with delays. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Cassiana McClenahan.
Car enthusiasts from around the world made their way to the Javits Center in Manhattan today for the opening of the New York International Auto Show. The show included the hottest innovations in automotive technology, like electric and driverless cars.
But in Arizona last month, a driverless Uber car hit and killed a pedestrian. And Bo Hamby reports that now many are hesitant to embrace this new technology.
Way at the very back of the Javits Center, past the crowds of people taking pictures of supercars, past the Honda section blasting rock music, and past the large tour groups looking at Mini Coopers, is where you'll find Jaguar's driverless SUV. Nicole Scotton is taking pictures of the car, and she's intrigued.
It is an exciting idea for the future, and definitely something that is going to be prevalent, so it's cool to kind of check it out.
And she says the crash earlier this month that killed a pedestrian was unfortunate, but something that's going to happen whether there's a computer or a human behind the wheel.
It's definitely a concern, but I guess I also kind of balance that with the idea just that car crashes happen all the time, even when you're driving it yourself. So accidents are going to be inevitable, I think, in either situation.
But most of the people at the car show are definitely not in favor of driverless cars. Some people don't trust the technology, and some just enjoy driving too much to give it up. EJ Nelson is 12 years old, and he's never driven a car, but he wants to when he's old enough.
Yeah, I think probably the driving experience is more fun than like having a car drive for you would take away all the fun out of driving, you know?
EJ's mom, Josie, doesn't trust the tech, especially after the fatal crash in Arizona.
No, I think driverless cars are potentially incredibly dangerous for the future of the world. I don't think we should put that trust in technology. We need a human being behind the wheel.
Roger Lonto is Director of Automotive Connected Mobility at Strategy Analytics. He's not surprised that people are hesitant to embrace driverless tech after the crash earlier this month. But he says that failure is on Uber and not the rest of the industry.
It's just a pure reflection on Uber and nobody and nothing else.
He says that's why we shouldn't focus on the crash, because other companies are making the tech work.
The most significant takeaway from this is the fact that there are dozens of companies, organizations, startups working on testing this technology, and Uber was the only one that killed somebody.
Mike Ramsey is more skeptical. He's the head automotive analyst at the research company Gartner in Detroit. He says that driverless cars will be part of our future, but there are a lot of hurdles that tech needs to tackle before we see it everywhere.
How will governments regulate these vehicles? How will they be insured? How will insurance companies deal with accidents not caused by the robot, but people who run into these things? Okay, how do you investigate that? How do you get information from the vehicle? How does a police car tell one of these vehicles to stop?
Back at the Jaguar section in Javits, Scott Anderson is examining the driverless car. And he's thinking about the crash earlier this month.
If I was driving that car and that person came out of the dark, would I have missed them? You know, I don't know. We're holding an autonomous driving car to a higher standard than we're holding ourselves.
He looks around at the rest of the Javits Center, then offers his thoughts on the future.
75% of all the people in this building right at this very moment are car guys that love driving their own car, that love the feel of the road and love the wind in their hair. But there are 25% people in this building that could care less if they drove or they didn't. So I think that this is going to be a wonderful opportunity to get to and from wherever you choose.
According to Ramsey, the analyst at Gartner, driverless tech will be used by pretty much everyone sometime around 2030. Until then, humans will still be behind the wheel. Bo Hamby, Columbia Radio News.
Every month, there's a small charge on your cell phone bill, typically a couple of dollars, for something called the Universal Service Fund. It supports federal programs to subsidize phone and broadband services for low-income and rural Americans.
But now the FCC is proposing changes that could cause many Americans to lose this subsidy, making it harder for them to get online. Cassiana McLenahan has more on how the de Blasio administration is trying to close the digital divide.
Jackie Davis was used to living on her own, but last summer her 14-year-old granddaughter, Kiara, moved in with her, and with her came the internet.
It was really basically for my granddaughter, but she really needs it for the school.
At the Queensbridge houses in Long Island City, where Davis and Kiara live, getting hooked up to the internet is free. In 2015, Mayor de Blasio launched a $10 million initiative to install broadband in 5 public housing developments. Queensbridge is the pilot site. Today, all 96 buildings have free Wi-Fi available, which Davis appreciates because, as she explained on the phone, she's frugal.
I'm on a set income because I retired. I try to eliminate unnecessary things like cable. I don't have cable.
Davis's granddaughter, Kiara, commutes 2 hours each way from her home in Queens to her school in East New York. She says most of her homework has to be submitted online. If she didn't have Wi-Fi available at home, she'd have another trip every day to find an internet connection.
Tonight I'm working on this Google Classroom thing, and it's like a homework thing that I work on every day with the internet.
A city grant covered the project's installation, and it's paying the monthly services fee for the first 3 years. After that, New York City is counting on the $9.25 federal Lifeline subsidy to kick in and keep the service free and available for residents. But FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has proposed some big changes to the Lifeline program.
He wants more and more money to go to the rural areas. He doesn't really give a whit about poor people in urban areas, and you can see that in this proposal.
That's Gigi Sohn. She was a counselor to the previous FCC chair under President Obama. She says Pai's proposals would redirect funds away from urban areas. He also wants to cap Lifeline's funding, though the exact amount hasn't been determined.
He's proposing a budget cap that if the cap was exceeded, then some people wouldn't get their Lifeline subsidy.
Lifeline has historically been a rampant source of fraud and abuse.
Daniel Lyons is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank.
So, for example, there were a number of companies that were going out signing up Lifeline-eligible households for service with their company, even though those households were already signed up with another company.
Lyons says people were collecting the benefit twice, which is fraud. Pai says that capping the total amount of money in the program would incentivize the agency to crack down on this kind of behavior. In addition to the cap, Pai is trying to limit Lifeline subsidies to only go to providers that own connection infrastructure, think AT&T or Verizon. But today, 70% of Lifeline recipients use companies that resell these larger carriers' services. This move would kick them out of the program, decreasing competition and potentially increasing prices. All of this has put Lifeline in limbo, and that has ripple effects here in New York City. Miguel Gamino, the city's chief technology officer, says it's scrambling to come up with alternatives to continue funding increased internet access.
If your kids have internet access at home and mine don't, then regardless of any other factor, my kid would be at a severe disadvantage to competing in the classroom with your kid. All other things aside.
Pai's proposals are making their way through the FCC. The agency could issue a final rule as early as this spring. Cassiana McClenahan, Columbia Radio News.
Richard Carranza will become New York City's new school chancellor on Monday, and he inherits a school system that's one of the most racially segregated in the nation.
Last night, teenagers gathered in Brooklyn to talk about how segregation affects them. Stevie Hertz reports.
In Brooklyn last night, an auditorium at the public library was packed, with people standing in the aisles and others sitting on their backpacks. Students from across New York gave testimony about how school segregation affects their lives, and to call for change.
This system is swaying under the weight of the students who need saving, and we are tired of our demands and voices being blocked.
Teens Take Charge organized the event. Standing and watching were two high school students, Mamrie and Coco.
My name is Mamie Barry. I currently go to school at the Marcus Park Charter High School.
My name is Coco Rum. I'm a junior at Beacon High School.
I have a love-hate relationship with my school.
I love it there. It's an amazing school.
But I had moments where I struggled academically and socially.
My teachers are awesome. They are engaged and they're caring.
There are other important differences between their schools. Mamrie's is a charter school with a lottery to get in, and Coco's is a screen school, so they pick their students based on academics. And there's also another difference between their schools. Mamrie's school,
99% black and Latino.
And Coco's,
51% white.
Coco and Mamrie aren't alone in their experience. Professor Aaron Pallas has studied segregation in New York City schools, and he says there's many causes of this, especially housing patterns.
Because where one goes to school is often rooted in where one lives, and the neighborhoods in New York City historically have been very segregated by race. The fact white people don't like having their kids go to school with black children. They also don't particularly like having black neighbors.
And it's not just about living in the right zone to go to a school. There are other barriers too, such as tests, like the one Coco needed and Mamrie didn't. Students of color statistically do worse on these kind of standardized tests. The city's Department of Education was not immediately available to comment for this story. Hallie Potter researches school diversity with a nonprofit, the Century Foundation. She says the Department of Education is using a number of approaches to try to reach their integration goals.
The main one being establishing an advisory committee that is working over this year to specifically look at the goals that have been set and at some of the strategies that the city can use to reach them.
According to an independent report, they'll be met by demographic change, even without any differences in policies. Eric Nadelstern was the Deputy Chancellor of New York City Schools. He retired in 2011.
And it's a chief regret of mine is we did not work hard enough to integrate the New York City schools.
And he says the only way to significantly shift the racial makeup of schools is to get rid of tying what school you go to where you live. But he says this change could be hard.
I wish the Chancellor luck. I would suggest that he adopt the policy of unzoning the city schools and understand that by so doing, he would place a large target on his back. But you have to be fearless and courageous to be successful in New York.
And so, when the new school chancellor takes office on Monday, he'll have plenty to address. Stevie Hertz, Columbia Radio News.
And finally, we close out today's show with reporter Madeline Thompson. She tells us about summer afternoons spent with her favorite singer at her grandparents' lake house.
Recently, I was out with some friends when the subject of our favorite bands and musicians came up. I panicked a little and I lied. It's not the Shins, it's Frank Sinatra. That's right, I'm 100 years old, but Frank makes me feel like I'm 11 again.
Out of the tree of life, I just picked me a plum.
At that age, I spent summers running around barefoot at my grandparents' lake house, where Sinatra records often blared. The record player sat in the damp basement on top of a wooden cabinet stuffed with LPs. My grandfather would put music on and then make himself a gin martini, the sound of the silver shaker competing with Sinatra's voice. I'd be outside, jumping off the warm wooden deck into water oily with sunscreen. Sinatra, with his reputation for womanizing and his alleged mob ties, has been with me ever since, like a security blanket or a lucky hairband. I first heard of the city I now call home in that terribly overplayed song, New York, New York. Before I'd ever visited here, I was completely convinced of the city's magic. And I first discovered that you can write about people as a job when I read Gay Talese's wonderful Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. Flash forward 15 years, that girl is now a journalist living in New York City. Sinatra is actually from Hoboken, New Jersey. I know this because I spent my 24th birthday on a Sinatra-themed bus tour run by the Hoboken Historical Museum. My friend Annie and I were the youngest people by at least 20 years, but probably the most excited. We took a selfie in front of the empty lot that used to be his childhood home. We ate a piece of sourdough bread from a bakery he may or may not have gone to. We looked out at the city from atop a lush hill at Stevens Institute of Technology, where Sinatra supposedly spent exactly one day before quitting school to pursue his singing career. The guy didn't seem to want to leave a lot of roots in Hoboken. Just a few days after that birthday, Frank Sinatra would have turned 100, but our matching star signs aren't why I love him. Sinatra's music is emotional, romantic, genuine, all things I am not. He makes me feel like a completely different person, but also more myself than ever. I was never more myself than when I was 11, listening to rain bounce off a tin roof and eating hot dogs right off the grill. Right now, at 25, I miss that more than ever. Everything in my life feels fragile and uncertain. There's nothing as solid as a wooden deck under my feet, and nothing's as easy as it was at my grandparents' lake house. But Sinatra's music has stayed the same, and I'm clinging to it. I don't know, maybe the best is yet to come.
Best is yet to come, and babe, won't that be fine? You think you've seen the sun, but you ain't seen it shine. Wait till the warm-up's on.
That's it for our show today. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Uptown Radio.
Our executive producer today was Mira Gable. Our senior producer was Augusta Anthony, and our senior editor was Wendy Rhodes.
Madeline Thompson directed the studio team with help from producers Colin Marston and Eileen Grench. This stream made it live to the web thanks to Juan Torres Falcon.
And a special thank you to Radio Pros behind the scenes. That's Sally Herships, Deb Amos, Gilda DeCarli, and Ben Shapiro, with support from Carrie Donahue. I'm Sarah Wyman.
And I'm Jennifer Siegel. Uptown Radio will be back next Friday, live at 4 p.m. Until then, you can find us at uptownradio.org. Thanks for listening.